great civilizations that existed during the 1,000 years preceding the birth of Christ were the seedbeds of the great world religions. The empires of Persia, stretching from Mesopotamia to the Hindu Kush, of the great river valleys of China, of the vast Indian subcontinent, and finally of Rome, embracing the Mediterranean world. For the most part, these religions were to develop within a brief period in comparison with the entire span of human history. Indeed, the outstanding prophets and reformers of Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and the religions of China were all near contemporaries. Vast empires rose and fell, but the influence of these men in the form of the religions they shaped lived on. In spite of persecution, the great world religions have survived, shaping our way of life in education, moral codes and behavior, and paradoxically, sometimes fanning the flames of political turmoil. We can only speculate why the great world religions arose. Perhaps as the empires grew, embracing not only larger areas but also many disparate peoples and customs, a need developed for more universal creeds than the local tribal gods of early times could provide. Early man had believed the natural world to be one of spirits. These were later replaced by gods and goddesses, the Earth Mother, rain and sun gods, and others such as the Egyptian god Osiris, who was believed to control vegetation and the flooding of the Nile. Similar specific functions were also true of the gods of Greece and Rome. Ares or Mars, the god of war, and Aphrodite or Venus, the goddess of love. Early religions were restricted to local cults, with individual tribes and groups worshipping their own gods, as some still do today. The Yoruba of West Africa, for instance, worship an elaborate hierarchy of deities, which includes a supreme creator and some 400 lesser gods and spirits. The great world religions were different. All, to one degree or another, shared a belief in a single spiritual reality valid for all mankind. The transition from a multitude of local cults to half a dozen world religions was the achievement of a remarkable series of reformers. Zoroaster in Persia. In India, Mahavira. And also Gautama. In China, Confucius. And Lao Tzu. And the Old Testament prophets of the people of Israel. Although little is known about these men personally, what seems certain is that all were reacting to the tensions of their age. They were all at work independently in widely separated regions, and it was their vision that gave birth to the world religions. Hinduism is the religion of 400 million Indians. As early as Vedic times, processions and pilgrimages were made to holy rivers, and this aspect of Hinduism is still important today, the river Ganges being of particular sanctity. The earliest sacred scriptures, the Vedas, go back to the arrival of the Aryan invaders in northern India. Their beliefs held the seeds of many later systems of religious thought. Their emphasis on sacrifice and the notion of caste set fundamental social patterns which have continued to shape life in India for 3,000 years. Mahavira and Gautama Siddhartha, the reformers of Hinduism, were both noblemen by birth. Both were alienated by the suffering and distress they saw about them, and both sought poverty and a pious life, abandoning their wealth and position in society. Mahavira was the founder of a rigorous Hindu religion called Jainism. Its following was always limited, although there are still 1 million Jainas living in Western India today. Mahavira emphasized certain aspects of Hinduism such as ahimsa, the doctrine of non-violence to both men and animals, which was to influence the work of Mahatma Gandhi. Hindus worship a number of gods, the most important of which are Vishnu and the destroyer and healer, Shiva. Vishnu has many incarnations, including the hero Rama, and Krishna, a beneficent god. Shiva's wife, the mother goddess, appears both as a gentle Parvati and the fierce Kali. Hindu society is strictly divided into hereditary social classes or castes. There is a belief that the caste system owes its origin to the Varnas, representing a fourfold division of society into classes. These are said to have originated from the body of the creator, Brahma. The Brahmins, or priestly and learned class, from Brahma's mouth. The Kshatriyas, noblemen and soldiers, from his arms. And Vaisyas, farmers and merchants, from his thighs. And the Sudras, peasants and laborers, from his feet. Those outside this caste system were known as the untouchables. Through a series of reincarnations, a soul may improve his position within a caste by means of right actions or karma. Thus, many cults with widely differing practices exist side by side. As well as worshipping a number of gods, Hinduism offers various approaches to the ultimate, through physical discipline, knowledge, personal devotion, good works, or contemplative discipline. Always more than a religion, it is a complete way of life. The influence of Gautama, born in 560 BC in northeast India and known to posterity as the Buddha, or the Enlightened One, was wider spread than that of Mahavira. Buddhism emerged within the context of Hinduism, but was later to become one of the world's great missionary religions. It was unusual in that it did not center upon a god, but rather upon deliverance from suffering and the attainment of nirvana, the blessed state reached when the flame of desire has been extinguished. Ever since Gautama's death, his teaching has been kept alive by his followers, who live together in monastic communities. But it was the conversion in about 257 BC of Asoka, the greatest of the Mauryan emperors of India, moved, as he himself said, by remorse at the slaughter and misfortune he had caused, that made Buddhism into a major force. In edicts inscribed on rocks and pillars scattered throughout India, Asoka spread the Buddhist virtues of compassion, tolerance and respect for all forms of life. It was under Asoka that Buddhism began its missionary vocation, spreading to the Hellenized kingdoms beyond the Hindu Kush, and to Sri Lanka and Burma. In the form known as Theravada, conservative and traditionalist, Buddhism became established throughout Southeast Asia. With Hinduism, it was a formative influence in this region, and many fine remains survive there today. Equally important was the spread of Buddhism northwards to the Kushan kingdom in modern Afghanistan, a great empire astride the trade routes linking east and west. For here, a new form of Buddhism took shape, known as Mahayana, meaning the great vehicle which would bear all mankind to salvation. Mahayana Buddhism was more open to popular doctrines and local practices, one of its characteristics being the bodhisattvas, who, rather like Christian saints, could help ordinary mortals to salvation. This gave great impetus to Buddhism, which spread rapidly through Tibet and Central Asia, moving on from China to Korea and reaching Japan around AD 550. In Japan, a synthesis of the two religions, Buddhism and traditional Shinto spirit worship, developed. At the core of Shinto is the belief in the mysterious power of kami, the sacred power, which can be recognized every moment in every individual existing thing. By this time, Buddhism had lost its foothold in its homeland. Today, there are virtually no Buddhists left in India. It was a rejuvenated and purified Hinduism which survived. Buddhism made only limited headway in China, where emphasis was put on the kings of hell, each king being responsible for punishing different crimes. But there were already two long-established religions in China, Confucianism and Taoism. The early people of China had maintained ancestor cults and worship of nature spirits. Kung Fu Tzu, or Confucius, born in 551 BC, did not doubt the reality of the spiritual world, but his concern was with the conduct of man. Confucianism was not so much a religion as an ethical code, which was concerned with propriety and human relations based on love and respect for one's fellows. Living at the time when the Chu Empire was beginning to disintegrate, Confucius's reaction sprang from a concern with the disorders and injustices of his day. In the 2nd century BC, Confucianism was declared the official dogma of the Qin Empire, and it remained supreme until the fall of the Manchu dynasty more than 2,000 years later in 1911. But it was always an upper and middle class code with limited popular appeal. Too much was left out, the mysteries of nature, the depths of human passion, and this gap was filled by the third Chinese religion, Taoism. This was founded on a book, the Tao Te Ching, in which the essence of the Tao, or the Way, is expressed in parables and metaphors. This book is attributed to the shadowy figure Lao Tzu. Man's call was to live in harmony with the Tao, and the emphasis of the Tao Te Ching is on humility and passivity. There are obvious parallels here with the teaching of the Buddha, and also with the later ideas of Christianity. But unlike Christ, Lao Tzu did not offer the consolation of an afterlife. Eventually, however, Taoism degenerated into a superstitious religion of demons and magic. It was once thought that Zoroaster, or Zarathustra as he is sometimes known, lived between 600 and 500 BC, but it's now believed that he might have lived 1,000 years earlier. Zoroastrianism was the first rigorously intellectual creed in history and became the religion of the Persian Empire. Zoroaster's message was lofty and abstract. He believed in a great spirit, Ahura Mazda, beneficent and good, confronted by another powerful spirit, Angra Mainyu, the adversary, malign and ignorant. Life was seen as a battleground between good and evil, order and chaos, light and darkness, with a final judgment and resurrection of the blessed. On the side of Ahura Mazda were the powers of light, the sun and fire, and there was a tradition of fire altars and worship in the open. The strength of Zoroastrianism was its clearly defined explanation of evil. This explains its appeal to the many subject peoples within the vast Persian Empire. Those who obeyed Ahura Mazda's injunctions would attain immortality. Zoroaster also believed that the end of the world would come in due course, and that Ahura Mazda would send a bolt from heaven to smite the wicked. Its militancy appealed to the great warrior kings of Persia and to the later Persian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty. Today, Zoroastrianism is only practiced by the Parsis of India and by a small body of believers in Iran. Mithraism was a cult which developed from Zoroastrianism. It adopted its militancy and the central symbolism of the sun, but the most important Mithraic ceremony was the sacrifice of the bull. It was a closed cult, spread by soldiers, traders, and civil servants throughout the Roman Empire. Altars are found as far afield as the frontier outposts in Germany, North Africa, and in Britain, but its followers remained relatively few. Zoroastrianism also left its mark on Judaism and Christianity in the struggle between good and evil, in the symbolic figures of angels and demons, and in the promise of resurrection and final judgment. Judaism, however, was centered around the worship of one God from the very beginning, when Moses made his famous covenant with Yahweh, or Jehovah, after the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt around 1290 BC. Judaism, with its profound ethical code embodied in the Ten Commandments, was the exclusive tribal religion of the people of Israel, with its center in Jerusalem from the 11th century BC. A major turning point came when the Jews were carried off in exile to Mesopotamia, following the sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 586 BC by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. 50 years of captivity loosened the local ties of Judaism and turned it into a universal creed. Although the process had started with the prophet Amos in the 8th century BC, the prophets who maintained the faith in exile interpreted the traditional Jewish law, the Torah, in new ways, switching the emphasis from observance and sacrifice to morality and right conduct. The Torah consists of the first 5 books of the Bible and is believed by Orthodox Jews to have been handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai. It begins with a description of the creation and ends upon the death of Moses and a description of the promised land, Israel. Judaism was to emerge from the crucible of exile and affliction a powerful religious force. Yahweh was no longer merely the God of the Jews. He was the Lord of all mankind. Although the Persian Emperor Cyrus permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple in 538 BC, the Jews were to suffer almost continually from the political and military domination of others. By AD 200, the Jews were widely spread in large communities all over the Mediterranean world. Yet throughout this dispersion or diaspora, they always regarded Palestine as their homeland. Often persecuted and oppressed, they depended for their identity upon their faith. As Buddhism had grown out of Hinduism, so Christianity grew out of Judaism. Judea had been conquered by the Romans in 63 BC. The result was religious, political, and nationalistic tension. A number of movements had sprung up in response to the oppression of the Jews. Some were spiritual, such as the Essenes. Others were political, such as the Zealots. When Jesus of Nazareth began to preach in about AD 27 that the kingdom of God was at hand, it was a message for which many Jews had been waiting. Since the time of the Babylonian exile, the prophets had foretold the coming of a Messiah or deliverer, and for his followers, Jesus seemed to be this Messiah. He proclaimed and demonstrated Yahweh's presence and love, and the need to live by the same Spirit. However, after a short-lived burst of enthusiasm, Jesus' popular following declined, and in about AD 30, he was seized by the Jewish authorities, handed over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and crucified as a revolutionary. Even his closest disciples were disillusioned, but their faith was restored by the resurrection, when Jesus Christ appeared before them. They then proclaimed that he would return in glory on the day of judgment. At this stage, Christianity was still a Jewish cult, but a turning point came with the conversion of Paul, formerly a persecutor of Christians. Paul's missionary journeys broke new ground in reaching out to Gentiles or non-Jews. His first journey took him to Cyprus, his second to Asia Minor, Greece, and the Aegean. Denying that Jesus was sent merely to redeem the Jews, but rather to atone for the sins of all mankind, he made two further journeys, the third being through Asia Minor, Greece, and the Holy Land, and the final journey taking him as far as Rome. Paul's message found a responsive audience. Converts to Christianity did not have to conform to Jewish law. Faith in Christ and a reformed life as members of a Christian community were enough. The result was a break with Judaism. By severing these ties, Christianity became an independent world religion, spreading throughout the Roman Empire in spite of intermittent persecution. But it was never confined to Roman dominions alone. Missionaries from Egypt carried the message south to Nubia and Ethiopia in East Africa, and a Christian church was also established in India. From Syria, Christianity spread to Persia, and from there along the trade routes of Central Asia as far as China. A major turning point came in AD 313, when the Roman Emperor Constantine granted the Christians toleration. Christianity was later made the state religion of the Roman Empire in AD 392, and rival cults were suppressed. A new chapter in the history of Christianity now commenced. It had begun as the faith of humble people. Now it became an organized church with an elaborate hierarchy closely identified with the Roman state. The predominance of Christianity in the Near East would continue until Islam, the last great world religion, burst upon the world after the death of its founder Muhammad in AD 632. But this story belongs to another phase, and we shall return to its history later. In any case, the story we have followed, covering a little more than 1,000 years, is remarkable enough. It demonstrates the impact of individuals upon history. They were all, except perhaps Confucius, humble men without personal ambition, men who were striving to make the world a better place. And the astounding thing is the way their work lived on. The influence of that generation of reformers living between 600 and 500 BC and the missionary activity of Buddhism and Christianity were of great importance for world history. Hitherto disparate regions were brought into contact with each other, creating a new kind of world map, unhindered by physical or political barriers. The great world religions had arisen as messages of peace and righteousness, but contrary to all that their founders willed and believed, they were also a source of discord and conflict. And so, alas, they remained. There is an irony here, which we should perhaps do well to ponder.